Hi there, esteemed audience, and welcome to episode 50 of Middle Grade Ninja. I'm your host, Rob Kent, and I couldn't be more excited. Probably by the time we get to episode 100, that's when we'll do some sort of major celebration. But episode 50 is a pretty huge milestone since when I started this, I didn't know if we'd make it to episode 2. So I couldn't be more thrilled with the result, and I hope you're enjoying it as well. I remain grateful to everyone who listens, who talks about it on social media. If you've left a review, I so greatly appreciate that. Let your friends know that any other writers you know out there who might also be looking for information on writing and publishing, who might want to hear these amazing conversations that we're having every week, let them know that this is happening. Because I want to make this available for free to as many people as possible. I don't know where the show is going. I wish I could tell you I had a firm, concrete plan that episode 200 and then that'll be it. I don't know. If for some reason the show went away tomorrow, I would be very grateful for the incredible conversations we've had thus far. And for all that I know I've learned, and I hope you've learned something listening to these authors and publishing professionals share with us every week. To keep tabs on what's coming up with the show, find out who our future guests are going to be, check out the archives for those first 49 episodes prior to this, plus a couple of bonus features, head to middlegradeninja.com. While you're there, you can't help but miss that I've got a book. It's called Banneker Bones and the Giant Robot Bees. It is an 11-year-old biracial boy detective genius inventor of robots who fights giant robot bees with an EMP blast rifle while riding around on a jetpack. It's an amazing story. I'm a huge fan. You can get it as a paperback, an audiobook, or the ebook is free to download whenever you're watching or listening to this, wherever fine ebooks are sold. Once you're hooked on the series, check out the sequel, Banneker Bones and the Alligator People, and the upcoming third, still yet to be revealed, Banneker Bones Adventure. One of these days, I'm just going to let it slip. Not this day. Maybe episode 100. Under the super secret pen name Robert Kent, I've written the young adult novel All Together Now a Zombie Story, as well as the Book of David, which is a 5-volume serial horror novel about an atheist who buys a haunted house that then begins to give him religious visions. It's for adults only, but if you are an adult and you're curious to see me do my Stephen King impersonation, check out the Book of David. Chapter 1 is available to download for free as an ebook whenever you're watching or listening to this, wherever fine ebooks are sold. And that's it. Episode 50. Here we go. Let's get started. Today I'm chatting with Mariama Lockington. Mariama, how are you today?
I am doing really well, Rob. Thank you so much for having me. I was excited to be on.
Thank you very much for making the time. I am thrilled to chat with you, and I'm so glad you're our guest for 50 because I'm expecting huge things. I know this is, I don't want to jinx it, but I think this is going to be our best episode ever. So,
okay. No pressure.
No pressure whatsoever.
Okay.
So let's start with, if you don't mind, I'm terrible with other people's biographies and other people's books. So if you would just tell esteemed audience a little bit of an overview of your background.
Yeah. So I am an author and also an educator. And I have a middle grade novel that just came out in July called For Black Girls Like Me. I grew up a little bit of everywhere, but I currently live in Lexington, Kentucky. So when I talk with young people about what they know about Kentucky, usually the first thing they say is fried chicken. But then some people do get that we have a big horse industry here. Big, Kentucky Derby races, the home state of Muhammad Ali. And so it's fun to sort of talk to young people about all the different places that I've traveled to and lived in. I've lived in 7 different states, both as a kid and as an adult. So that's a fun thing. And I've been writing for a really long time, but I've also been working sort of in education nonprofits, working to support teachers and students in sort of out of school time. And so those are my big 2 passions, is writing and storytelling for young people. For adults, I write poetry as well. And then also working with young people in educational spaces. So.
Gotcha. So lots to unpack there. It's a heck of an impressive resume. What kind of out of school teaching? What does that entail?
Yeah, so I started out my sort of education career working for an organization called Citizen Schools, which is a program that's similar to like a Teach for America. I got a teaching fellowship, and after I graduated from the University of Michigan, I went out to San Francisco Bay Area. And basically, what I did is during the school day, I was assigned a middle school, and I worked with the teachers to support specific students during the school day that were then going to be coming to our after school program. And then after school, I ran a classroom of students, both helping them with homework. And then we did something called apprenticeships. So volunteers would come in and want to teach something that they were an expert on. So wanting to teach an art class, or I helped a volunteer come up with a curriculum for etiquette because she really wanted to teach young people about etiquette, or financial planning. And so my job then was to work with volunteers to come up with a curriculum to sort of teach to middle school students about those different things. And so it was both a program that was doing practical homework help, and then also getting young people to think about future careers and future passions that they might have in the world. And that's sort of how I got started. And then when I was done with my fellowship, it was a 2-year fellowship, I found an organization called 826 National, which was actually started by an author, Dave Eggers, and an educator, Nineveh Caligari, out in San Francisco. And it's a network of, at the time, it was 6 or 7. I think they've expanded now, writing and tutoring centers all across the country that specifically focused on getting young people to write creatively, also helping them, with their academic writing. And then also my favorite thing was actually publishing young people in professionally bound works that designers, designed, editors edited, and then the books were sort of sold in the writing centers and in stores in the different cities. And so I had the pleasure of working for that organization for 7 years and getting to do a lot of in-schools publishing projects with young people and help them become published authors before they even graduated middle or high school. So.
Can I get a time machine for you to come back to me when I was in middle school and high school to help me do that? That sounds amazing.
Yeah, me too. I would have loved a program like that. And it really was, some of my biggest joy was like watching those books get put together and then watching young people understand that we were going to actually have like a book release party, and they were going to get to sort of read from their books, and then have their parents or family members and community members come and like get a copy of the book and actually sign a book as an author. So I feel like I got to watch young people signing books before I ever had to do it myself. And that's a really cool thing.
I've got all kinds of questions for you, but what did working with young people, the target audience for your book for Black girls like me, I assume, at least a big part of it. What did working with those people, young people, on publishing and helping them write and learn to do that, teach you about writing and bring to your work?
Yeah, that's such a good question. I've always known that I wanted to be a writer myself and be a storyteller and pursue publishing. But I've also always known that that I needed to not be, I think writing can be sometimes very solitary, which you need in order to get the work done. But I also knew that I needed another passion in my life that would bring me out into the community and make sure that I was interacting and talking and learning from others. I'm definitely a nerd, a lifelong learner. I love school. We can talk more about that later. And I love books, and I love school, and I love storytelling, and I liked being in the classroom when I was a young person. And so becoming an adult and finding myself working with young people just seemed sort of like a natural move. What I love about writing for middle grade, I love working with high school students too, but middle grade and middle school is actually my favorite sort of place to live, is that I think that what I've learned from that age group is that there's this unfilteredness, and young people have not yet gotten worried necessarily about if they're saying the right thing, but they just have a ton of questions. And yeah, sometimes they blurt out things that, you have to have a conversation about why did you hear that and why do you believe that? But they're still forming their identities, but they're also really honest and really truthful with you. And so I think that I've learned sort of that from working with young people, is sort of that just like curiosity and that wonder that I think exists at that specific age. And yes, it's awkward and sometimes a little bit smelly, and people are trying to figure out their feelings and their bodies, but I really love that sort of wonder and curiosity and magic of that age. And I think it reminds me as an adult not to take things so seriously, and then also not to be so afraid of things that I don't know, that I'm still trying to figure out. And I think young people, specifically middle schoolers, can really teach us a lot about the world, and a lot about resilience too. I think my book is a book that is a book about a young girl who is Black and adopted. And so she's growing up in a white family. And there is a lot of joy and hope and fun in the book, but there's also some like tough subjects as well. And I think that young people can handle more than we think they can sometimes. And if you spend time with them, talking with them, I think that becomes apparent.
Yeah, no, that makes complete sense. I love that the young kids will blurt things out that are unfiltered. Because even when it's a terrible thing that you shouldn't say, they don't know that you shouldn't say it most of the time. And it's a learning opportunity for them, whereas adults still think those things are just better at hiding it.
Yes, exactly. And then it's a moment for a learning, a learning moment. That's just a follow-up question about, well, why are you saying that thing? If it's something that someone has blurted out that's problematic, it's an opportunity for growth and for a conversation about where that came from. And I don't think we do that as much as adults. I think, when someone says the wrong thing, we sort of tense up and, people get defensive or, all these things happen. And I think with young people, there's a little bit more room for us to have a conversation and sort of get to the bottom and the root of where that's coming from.
And well, I'm going to say you're going to be prompting some difficult conversations, I imagine, for Black girls like me.
Yeah.
So we will backtrack because I want to ask you about your nerdiness, as you say, and your love for higher education. Well, let me ask you about that real fast, and then let's talk for Black girls like me.
Okay.
But I was astonished to see that you've got both a master's in education and a master's of fine arts.
Yeah.
And I assume you're still studying in addition to everything else that you're doing, probably just for fun, because I assume that that at that point it becomes almost an addiction where you've got to keep learning and studying something. So how did that come about that you were mastering in both of those things?
Yeah, I think so as a kid, I actually I've experienced all different types of like learning communities and learning structures. So I went to a Montessori preschool when I was growing up, and then I also went to a Montessori high school. I was homeschooled for a little bit of a time, and then I graduated from a boarding school. And so I've had all these examples in my life of different ways that learning can happen both inside of a classroom and outside of a classroom. I personally, homeschooling was not my favorite because I do like the community that comes with being, at a school. And I liked sort of I'm a Capricorn. I liked the sort of consistency of like having a desk and having, a teacher tell you what is going to happen for the day. I liked those things. But in general, yeah, I've always just been someone who's been really interested in learning. And for me, reading was something that is something that I do voraciously now, and that I came to storytelling was something that I loved to do growing up, but I was a little bit of a slow reader at first. And once I really sort of hooked on to reading, I read widely. I read definitely out of my like middle grade bracket. Probably I read some adult books, some Toni Morrison, much too early in life.
How early?
I would say that I feel like I found The Bluest Eye when I was like 12 or 13, which, I was a middle schooler, but The Bluest Eye is a pretty tough book in a lot of ways. And so when I say that it sort of went over my head in some ways, I think that Toni Morrison's like language, and there were some things I just didn't maybe get initially from reading the book at that time. And then I sort of went back to Toni Morrison when I got to college, and maybe a little bit in high school, but mostly when I got to college. And that's also when I started to sort of like reread and devour her words and learn something new from them every time. So, yeah. But the question about school and learning. Yeah. So, I mean, yeah, I pursued poetry as my first love. And so I always was doing poetry and writing in college, and in high school, I was doing those things. And then I also knew I wanted to teach. And so after college, it just seemed like a natural transition to go into working with young people in a capacity while also pursuing sort of my creative efforts. And both of those things have really shaped sort of how I think about writing, how I think about the world today. And I'm not in school anymore, but as an author, I find myself in schools all the time for school visits, which have been really, really fun. And also in my nonprofit work, I've just found myself working with middle schoolers and high schoolers a lot as well.
There's some author, and I can't remember who said it. I would absolutely credit them, but said that being an author is like signing up to have homework every night forever.
Yeah.
It's very, very prescient.
Yes, that is true. That is true. I feel like you're doing homework about people that you are talking to. You're doing research and homework maybe for the books you're writing. And then just, making sure that when you go into a school, you have it together and that you're talking about things that are meaningful and engaging for young people as well.
So let me back up just a little bit, because you said you were a slow reader, and then that began to finally turn around to where you were able to tackle The Bluest Eye, which is an extremely complex book for a 12-year-old.
Yeah.
On the other hand, I was reading Stephen King about that same age. Not that the complexity of language is the same, but certainly the content is comparable. I'm trying to remember. Well, I guess I would have been about 13 when I read The Color Purple. That has some very much some adult content. So when did that turn around for you? And do you remember what the process was? Because anytime I talk to somebody who was a slow reader, who's now gone on to become an author and a very prolific reader, I know that all the librarians and teachers who are listening are leaning in close, saying, how can we get students to be future Mariama Lockingtons?
Well, so I think, I think what happened was just letting me self-select. So I think, so my mother actually pulled me out of a school in second grade. And my sister, who's a couple years younger than me, was in kindergarten at the time. And she felt like I wasn't really learning. I wasn't really reading where I should be. And homeschooling seemed like a really good option for us. And so she started taking us to the library. And she at first didn't sort of like force any books on us. She just sort of let us wander. And I think out of some boredom a little bit, I started reading series that looked interesting to me. They were not necessarily the books that I think my mom wanted me to read, but I got super hooked on like the Sweet Valley High series and Boxcar Children and Babysitter's Club, and just started reading those voraciously at the library and being really into those. I also loved, Ramona, the Ramona series and those books growing up too. And so those were the books that I sort of started reading. And then and then I think my mom, had her opinions about those series. And so she started to just like slip different classics into my room. And she really wanted me to read The Hobbit, really wanted me to read, The Chronicles of Narnia, different books like that. I remember like Jane Eyre appeared in my room one day when I was a little bit older, just like leaving me other books that she thought I should read. And so, eventually I found myself to some other texts and I found Toni Morrison. But I think when I found Toni Morrison, when I found The Bluest Eye, it was the first time that I had like seen a book with a Black girl so prominently on the cover, and then also the content, even though some of it was going over my head, this idea of being a little Black girl trying to love herself and trying to understand her beauty in terms of sort of bigger societal pressure as well.
Did your mother read to you when you were young?
She did, yeah. So she did read aloud to us, and so did my dad as well. So some of the series I definitely remember sort of us reading as a family were the Little House on the Prairie series. I think we did read some Chronicles of Narnia. I wasn't a big fantasy reader. I really wanted to read stories about girls or young people like me. My sister was more into like Redwall and Chronicles of Narnia and all those things. I I want to read about like real girls in history going through real things, real young people going through hard times. So I loved Hatchet. I loved My Side of the Mountain. I loved the Dear America. There were these Dear America diary series that were actually historical. So they were about young girls in specific times in history. And then they were hardback, and then they were all formatted as diaries. And so they were both historical and then also about young girls. And I think there was also a series that was a companion series that also featured young boys in history as well. And so I really loved those stories, and that's sort of where I gravitated to, whereas my sister was a little bit more into sort of fantasy and those worlds as well. So my mom did read aloud to us, and I think that was also important for just my love of storytelling in general. Like I think reading was hard, like was a struggle at first, but it wasn't because I wasn't interested in stories. And I think being able to self-select and then also just getting a little bored. And I grew up in a family that we didn't watch a lot of TV. And so.
Were there restrictions on the amount of time you were allowed to watch TV?
Restrictions, and like we really weren't a family that had cable, and we weren't, my mom was like, go outside and play, read a book type of a person. So
video games?
No, I definitely sometimes still feel clueless with video games, and not grow up playing video games and computer games sometimes, but no, I was definitely a very much like you read, go outside, have an adventure type of a household growing up.
Well, that sounds ideal. That's how you create future authors.
Yeah.
So I hope Mom gets thanked in the back of the book.
Yeah.
And then I wanted to follow that up with what author. I assume Toni Morrison is a huge influence on your work. Are there other authors that you might identify as well?
I feel like this question is always the question, and then all of them go out of my head instantly when someone asks this. I mean, Toni Morrison is a big influence. I would also say that there are a lot of poets that influenced me growing up, and then into sort of adulthood, young adulthood. So I loved Maya Angelou. I loved Nikki Giovanni, and I also in high school found a recording of the spoken word poet artist Saul Williams, and that was the first time I had heard someone do sort of more performative poetry. And I was obsessed with him and with that type of style, and then spent my entire senior year of high school writing very bad imitations of that particular type of poem. But that idea of getting up and sort of telling a story, memorizing a poem, putting it to music, really, really struck a chord with me. And so that's sort of how I got into sort of more performative poetry and writing when I went into college. I was doing it a little bit in high school, but then really found sort of my people and my community in college as far as spoken word and slam poetry. And then I love Octavia Butler, who wrote Parable of the Talents and Parable of the Sower. Is a Black woman who was writing science fiction. I love her work, and she really influences me. And Zora Neale Hurston, Their Eyes Were Watching God, is also in one of my like top 5, top 3 books.
So I guess Octavia Butler has some definitely some fantastical elements, but a lot of very, very serious, heady stuff.
Yeah.
That you're reading.
Absolutely.
And I know in stalking you online, I found that the first thing you wrote was in the 2nd grade. When did you go from wanting to write slam poetry and fun things to knowing that you wanted to write actual fiction and pursue specific books for young adults? Or is that what you want to do?
Yeah, so even though I am very happy to be in the middle grade space now, and it makes total sense that I'm here and I plan to be here for a while, I did not in my mind ever think about actually writing for young people as I was growing up. Writing initially or storytelling was actually just a means for survival for me. So, I'm listing all these sort of heady, serious inspirations. But for me, when I was growing up, because, we can talk about this a little bit later, but because I'm also adopted and I grew up in a white family. And so this book is inspired by some of my experiences and emotional things that I went through growing up. But for me, growing up, writing became a way to like put down some feelings I had and some questions I had about, my experience in the world compared to my parents or my other family members. And so I kept meticulous journals and diaries, some of them observing the world around me, some of them sort of all about my internal sort of turmoil and questions about my family versus, what about a family that I came from. And so for a while, that was what writing was for me. I think in high school, it shifted into this is something that I want to pursue and a craft that I want to work on. And for me, that was through poetry. So I mentioned that I went to a boarding school. I had the opportunity my senior year of high school to go to Interlochen Arts Academy, which is a arts camp and boarding school in northern Michigan. And when you go there as an academy student, you pick a major. And so I had gone for summer camp as a musician because my family is musical. And music taught me a lot about like how you practice something to get good at it. But writing really was the thing that I was like, I love doing this. I want to continue to do this and get better at it. So when I went for my senior year, I actually went as a creative writing major, and then put together a poetry thesis as a high school student to graduate from that program. And so it was really that point where I was like, well, that's what I want to pursue. I want to be a poet. I want to write poetry. I want to publish books. I still love reading fiction. I love nonfiction, but that sort of became the focus. And then I went into college and I found the slam poetry spoken word community scene there. I was on University of Michigan's like national slam team for 2 years and went to nationals and competed with other dramatic college students, all of us writing very raw poetry about our lives and our experiences. And then, after college, I was like, all right, I know I want to teach, but I also want to continue to pursue writing. And so I pursued my master's in education, but was always finding ways to still be performing or writing, or I had a lot of friends who were writers, so be sharing work with each other. And so this book, For Black Girls Like Me, actually technically started as my master's thesis and was actually a collection of poetry that was much more abstract and played around with form a lot more. But it was a collection of poems all in the voice of this 11-year-old girl. And it was much more autobiographical than this book is. But I graduated from my MFA program with, a 60-page poetry thesis that was about a girl who was adopted. And so there were these little vignettes of poems that kept coming back. And then I sort of struggled to figure out what to do with that, or how I was going to be a writer in the world after that program. But I published an essay about my experiences growing up as an adoptee in BuzzFeed. And from that essay, I got an email from my now editor asking if I'd considered writing a story inspired by my own story with a young Black girl who was adopted as a protagonist. And that is how I ended up in the kid lit in the, middle grade space, because once it sort of clicked with me that I could maybe take sort of the bones of this poetry manuscript, I was like, well, I've been writing about this 11-year-old girl forever, and sort of then change it, make it more plot driven, think more about the characters, fictionalize it. That is what became For Black Girls Like Me. And I was definitely feeling stagnant with the previous manuscript and didn't know what to do. And sort of when this became a path forward, it was really, really fun and rewarding to sort of jump into writing this for a middle grade perspective. It was a very long answer.
No, it was a great answer. I'm just trying to think of all the follow-up questions I have. One, I can't let pass because it's just a dumb question to satiate my own ignorance. How does one compete in slam poetry, and how do you know who's won? Haven't we all won if we all get to hear great poetry?
This is a great question. Obviously, it's very subjective, but there is a form to slam poetry. So basically, if you are competing in a slam, you put your name down, and then you have 3 minutes to deliver a poem. You're not allowed to use props. You don't have to memorize it, but you should. You should be sort of like off script because when you're reading off of a paper, that takes away from your performance a little bit. And then honestly, the way a poetry slam is judged is people from the audience volunteer to be a judge. And then you get a score. And your score is, what is it, 0 through 10? If the person running the slam is a kind person, they instruct people that you should never give anyone like less than a 5. Like you should never do that, but sometimes people would. And then, after you do your poem, you get a score. And I think there are 5 judges or so. And so maybe 3 or 5, I can't remember, depending on how it's being run. And so you get your score. And then there are 2 rounds. So if you make it through the first round, then you can repeat a poem in the second round. So the judging is there on the spot, often by just audience members, some who may have come there specifically to see a slam, some who just might be in the establishment that the slam is happening in. And then for like the national ones that are a little bit more like just like a college, college football team is going to play another team where you're taking your slam team to another institution to compete against other colleges. Sometimes they bring in like poets or authors from the areas to be the judges for those. But again, it's really subjective. You're supposed to get judged on, your performance, your writing, and then the delivery and the creativity. But that can be really subjective. So in some ways, I guess in some ways you should feel like you all won because you're getting a chance to get up on stage and, say a poem out loud. But it can get really competitive, and it was a really important community for me growing up, especially in college. Some of my dearest friends still I met through going to poetry slams every Thursday night at the University Union at University of Michigan. But it's hard to tell. It's like, how do you judge a poem? That's still a good question. I don't know if there's a good answer for it.
Is it possible to commit a foul at a poetry slam?
Yes, if you go past the 10-second grace period, so if you are reciting your poem, you get to that 3-minute mark, someone is timing you, and then you have a 10-second grace period. If you go past that, then absolutely you can be disqualified, honestly, if you go past the time. And then if you use props, if you're using like props on stage with you to sort of convey your story or your poem, that's also kind of a foul as far as poetry slams go.
So Carrot Top's out. He's not gonna be able to win the slam.
No. You can do group poems. So that you can have, 2 or 3 people come up and do a piece together. It still has to be under 3 minutes or under. So I also had these like late nights staying up instead of cramming for whatever exam I should probably have been cramming for. I was like writing a group piece with my friends and figuring out how to fit it all together. So it also was a lot about community as well.
So my experience I know lots of poets. My experience is rather limited to poems that rhyme and are more jokey than anything else. Because anything more than that, we're getting too close to my emotions. Careful now. Word you off a little bit. What does performing that poetry and competing with the poetry, how does that change your poetry from just sitting quietly and thinking just to yourself and, maybe burying it all? Who was it? Is it Emily Dickinson that just put all the poetry away and then died and then was discovered after the fact? What's the difference of being so extroverted with your poetry, and how does that improve your poetry?
I think there's I don't think that there's a right necessarily way to perform or write poetry. Some poets, their poems live on the page, and that is wonderful and perfectly fine. And some poetry is meant to be spoken, and that is also valid and wonderful, and it's all poetry. I think what I felt when I first, stumbled upon that Saul Williams poem that was like spoken out loud, and then when I went to my first poetry slam at University of Michigan, what I felt was that there was a way of inviting people in sort of real time that maybe didn't happen as much when I was reading a poem on the page. And so there was a real sense of community. And also, even if you've prepared a poem, you're not going to perform it the same way twice necessarily, right? Like each performance is in its own way sort of a live performance, and it's only going to happen that way once. And so you're inviting a group of people in a room to sort of experience that with you, and to be in that moment with you in a way that I think is different. I think you're still having a moment and an exchange when you're reading a poem on a page. That's also equally important. But for me, I felt there was a lot of power in that community. And then also a lot of power in standing up and trying to get to some type of truth with your poetry. I think the first time I went to a slam and I saw, a person who was my age get up on stage and, spit a poem that was talking about some like really real emotions and things that person was going through, something clicked to me like, oh, I can get up and I can work some things out on the mic. And I did. I'm also really glad that YouTube was not a thing when this was happening. There would certainly be more film of me on YouTube doing slam poetry if that had been a thing, but it wasn't yet. So I got
you had some material you just needed to work out before you got the good stuff.
I wrote some really dramatic, self-portraits, and I worked some things out on the mic, but I also felt like it was a space that I could do that. And that there was a really powerful and beautiful exchange that happened. And so it was people getting up and being vulnerable in this way that I hadn't seen before, and giving themselves and other people permission to be vulnerable on the mic. And then also just the sort of beauty and act of oral storytelling. I think there's such power in listening to a story and then speaking a story as well as there is reading something on the page. And so that was really important to me. And so I read some really dramatic poems of my own. I became really good friends with people. And then we, like I said, would cram and stay up all night and, rewrite, do retellings of things or put our poems together. We'd put our poems to music. And it was just a really wonderful community for me to be a part of when you're on a big campus and you're trying to figure out who your people are as well.
And obviously it didn't detract from your academic work, because you stand before me today with 2 masters. So that got done as well.
It did, although I definitely pushed it in some classes where it was like, turn in a 6-page paper, and instead I just turned in a poem. And so I definitely got called out by some teachers who were like, I can tell you're a really talented, poet, but you need to write like an academic paper for this. So, I tried. I pushed it as hard as I could in some classes.
And do you still compete in slam poetry? Are you planning a triumphant return?
I don't. I haven't. I did that a lot in college, and then a little bit after college when I moved out to San Francisco, Oakland, Bay Area. I think what I sort of shifted that energy into was teaching and supporting young people who wanted to write spoken word and slam poetry. And so I found myself judging. I've been a judge before and working with organizations like Youth Speaks in San Francisco, or there's an organization in Ann Arbor, Michigan called the Neutral Zone. So sort of turning my attention to the way that slam poetry, spoken word poetry can also give a lot of power and agency to young people is sort of where I shifted that energy. Because as I went into grad school, I started to experiment a little more with sort of blending a bunch of different forms together. So taking what I had learned from performing on the stage, and then also, I was taking fiction classes, nonfiction classes, and then also all my poetry classes. Some of them were about craft. Some of them were about producing more writing, about the business of writing. And so all of those things sort of like blended together. And I stopped performing, but I think that performance background has also helped me in a lot of different ways in various different jobs as I continue to work with young people and then write for young people.
You kind of become a coach, it sounds like.
Yeah, in some ways a coach. There you go.
Let's talk, it seems almost unfair to limit this to a middle grade novel because it's also a poetry collection amongst other things. So you know it better than I do. The last thing I want to do is me be here talking about your book when you, Mariama Lockington, are here and can tell us all about For Black Girls Like Me. So tell us about your book and what we need to know.
Yeah, so For Black Girls Like Me is a story that is a fictional story inspired by my own experiences, so an own voices story. And it is about an 11-year-old girl named Makeda who is adopted and growing up with two white parents and an older sister who is also her parents' biological child. But really, I like to start talking about this story because it's about a friendship initially. Makeda is has grown up in Baltimore with her best friend, Lena, who is also a Black adopted girl. And they have this strong bond based on their passions, but also that they share this common experience. And when Makeda's father, her parents are musicians, gets a new job in a different state, playing with a new symphony, Makeda has to leave behind sort of the only life she's ever known and her best friend for not only a whole new, school, but a whole new landscape. So she moves from Baltimore, Maryland, all the way to Albuquerque, New Mexico, and everything is really different. And while she is making this sort of, physical move across the country, she's going through some like growing pain things. So she's dealing with a sister who's too old, doesn't want to hang out with her. She's dealing with a mother who's going through some mental health issues of her own and a dad who's kind of absent. And so Makeda is starting to think and wonder a little bit about, how do I continue to be a part of this family and share who I am with them while I have all these questions and dreams about where I came from in the beginning. And then also while I'm trying to start over in this new place. And so when Makeda's transition to New Mexico and then her summer goes from sort of bad to worse when some things go down with her mom and her mom's mental health, Makeda turns to music and to sort of staying connected through letters with her friend Lena to sort of stay grounded in the world. So I like to say it's a story about friendship, about family. It's also a story about a young girl trying to find her voice and sense of belonging. And I think that when we're young, no matter what our context is, we're constantly questioning, do I belong here? Where do I belong? Who are my people? And then how do I express who I am through the identities that I am forming? And that's also what this book is a little bit about. So I call it my love letter to adoptees because it's definitely a book that when I was growing up looking for books on the shelves about girls who had my same type of family, I never found those books. So in some ways, I did the thing that I think Toni Morrison is attributed to saying, if there's a story that you want to see or read in the world, you have to write that story. In some ways, that's what I did with For Black Girls Like Me. But it's also a story that has so many, I think, universal themes, as well as the sort of specific context of Makeda being a Black girl adopted into a white family. So I'm having a lot of fun talking with young people about the ways they've seen themselves in the story, either directly related to Makeda's identity or differently as well.
And I assume you're not talking exclusively to Black girls that have been adopted by white families. I assume that multiple young people are able to come to this. It's a very universal tale. There's a way to identify with Makeda, I think, for every reader that comes in. So what are you hoping that people who are in that situation will take away from it, other than they're obviously, unlike you, who went to the library and wasn't able to find this book, they're here in 2019 going to go right up to the shelf. Oh, For Black Girls Like Me. Well, perfect. Yeah. That's that couldn't be more spot on. Excellent. Yeah. What are you hoping that they're going to take away from the book, and what are you hoping that people who aren't in that situation but can empathize with Makeda will take away from it?
Yeah. So, I mean, I hope my biggest hope is that young people who are adopted or growing up in multiracial families, maybe they have parents of different races or family members of different races, will be validated by some of the, experiences and feelings that Makeda is having in this book. I think, one of the things that I felt a really strong responsibility to sort of get right in the book was the fact that we as humans can live with multiple feelings happening at the same time. And one feeling doesn't necessarily mean a betrayal of another feeling. And so, as an adoptee, one of the things that's often imposed upon adoptees is this idea like you should feel so lucky all the time. You should feel so lucky that you've been given this quote unquote better life and that you were adopted. And what that does, it's not that we shouldn't practice gratitude in our lives, whoever we are. But what that does is sort of not acknowledge the fact that in order to become part of this family, a family that you were originally born into had to sort of fall apart, right? And so that there's a grief there as well. And so my hope is that this book for adoptees who, being an adult adoptee, talking to adult adoptees, where it's both things at the same time. Some of us both feel lucky and a bunch of gratitude and joy for the family that we were adopted into, and also feel this pain and this grief around something that we've lost, right? That we don't have access to because of our adoptions. And so my hope was in this book to validate the fact that you can feel multiple things at once. And so that dreaming about your biological family doesn't necessarily mean that you're betraying your family that you have grown up in. It means that you hold these two things at the same time. You belong in these two spaces. And so I hope that this book validates some of those feelings and wonderings for young adoptees or young people who are trying to put themselves into boxes or feel like I can't look at that feeling because if I feel those feelings or acknowledge that this is over here, I might hurt these people over here. And so that's a little bit of what I was hoping young people get away from this. And then also, so for people who are not in, Makeda's specific context, I think, again, just the understanding that we are human and that we feel lots of different things at once, and that the only thing that we can really control is our own agency and our own identities and our own feelings. And so I think acknowledging that sometimes really wonderful things happen alongside really hard things. Sometimes we leave friends and then we make new friends. Sometimes we are starting to find our voice, and then sometimes something really terrible happens with our mom, and those two things happen at the same time. And it's okay to be in that sort of messy place. That messiness of growing up is something that I really wanted to also validate in young people, or maybe even adults who are reading young people's literature, that it's okay to exist in those messy places, and to work through those, and to be confident in ourselves as we do that.
See, I don't like that. I want to exist where only good things happen. So how can I do that, Mariama? I need your advice to make my life constantly happy and perfect. No, nothing else. Thank you. I'm good.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's valid to also want to just exist in happiness too. I think, and I think that there are moments that Kata is existing in joy and in those moments, but there's also moments where she's not. And like I said, I was that kid who was like looking for stories that validated the sort of complicated emotions that I was having. And so in many ways, I wrote a story that I hoped would honor those things. And I was looking for a story that was like, yeah, sometimes really bad stuff or really hard stuff happens, even to young people, and to our parents. And we find out that our parents are not perfect, or that don't have all the answers, I should say. And then sometimes, even while that's happening, really wonderful, beautiful things are happening at the same time. And I always wanted those stories when I was growing up, because that's how I felt as a kid. I felt like I was holding those two things at once.
And then you discovered the secret you're not telling me to how to make sure only good things happen.
I don't know if I have that answer. I don't know. I wish.
Well, let me ask you a more practical question about the structure of the book. Why is it important to set the book over a year of Kata's life? And why was it important to start from that transition from Maryland to New Mexico?
So a couple of things. I think oftentimes books that have been written about the adoption experience have really focused on something that's called reunion. So they focused on that moment when the adopted person searches for, finds, doesn't find, whatever happens, their biological family. I really wanted to write a concentrated story that takes place over the year about a girl who is not at that point in her life yet, because she is part of a closed adoption. So she's actually not legally allowed to search until she turns 18. And so encapsulating Kata's story basically between, it's not even quite a year, it's almost, it's like 3 seasons, sort of helped concentrate that moment, a sort of this coming of age moment where not only this drastic transition as far as landscape is happening, but also I think so much can happen when you're a young person in the span of a year or a season or over a summer. I also really like summer or a transition that happens over a summer, because I think summers provide really rich landscape for storytelling as well. And so that felt like a good way to tell this story, is, you know, what happens in these 3 seasons to Makeda, and also that obviously she's still going to be experiencing throughout, but also concentrates it in this period of time. And then, I'm sorry, the other part of the question.
It was about just the transition from Maryland to New Mexico.
Yeah, so the thing that I did steal from my life as far as the setting is Maryland, Baltimore, and New Mexico are 2 of the many places that I've lived in my life. And I think I wanted a story that started on the road, because I think that there's something powerful about sort of road trip stories and starting in that place of I'm not here and I'm not there, which is also sometimes how Makeda feels about her identity. She's not here and she's not there sometimes. She's sort of in the middle of everything. So starting in like the middle of the country, starting on the road felt like a good place to sort of talk about Makeda's identity and her story as well.
That's some 3-dimensional chess right there.
and then New Mexico for me, I just remember moving there and just a drastic, you know, how drastic the landscape was and how beautiful it was. And so I wanted to set a story that sort of had that drastic change as far as landscape, because I think that in some ways that's also, I don't know if I would say it's also a character in the novel, but it also really helps to sort of highlight sort of Kata's sort of feelings of both invisibility and hypervisibility in these spaces that she's going through. And so it just seemed like the 2 good places to set it that were really drastic. And it's fun in school visits. I have a map where I show, you know, here's how many states Kata and her family drove through. I have a picture of sort of like the green, lush dogwoods of Maryland, and then like the Sandia Mountains and the sort of pink, red desert landscape. And it's fun to watch young people sort of take that journey with Kata, either, you know, on the page, but then also when I'm talking through it and sort of think about a place that's different from where they are as well. So I think they were just 2 landscapes that popped out to me as well, as far as telling her story.
Was that the order that you lived in them, from Baltimore to New Mexico?
It is, yeah.
So what are the biggest changes, biggest cultural differences that you encountered then?
From that move? Oh my gosh, it was so long ago. I also remember the landscape. I mean, it's not that I had never been sort of southwest before. I grew up partially also in Colorado, so I spent time in Denver and in Boulder, and so it wasn't completely foreign to me, but I just remember the dryness, and I think that was it. I was like the dryness of New Mexico, the cold, like I wasn't expecting how cold it could get in the desert, versus, and I think for me culturally, one of the biggest things was just, I personally felt a lot of isolation in New Mexico. I think I went from more of a community of folks in Baltimore, and New Mexico for me felt a little bit more isolated personally when I was growing up there. I don't know if the big cultural difference is. I just remember landscape and sort of this beautiful landscape and also this isolation that I was feeling at that time as well.
From a person who hasn't lived there, I'm hearing, okay, The Wire versus Breaking Bad, and I'm sure it's not that.
Definitely not, because I was definitely like a teen or a tween there. Yeah. But I think it's interesting thing about how much landscape can like set a mood or change a mood. And I feel like I need to go back to New Mexico as an adult because there's so much beauty there that at the time when I was living there as a teen that I sort of, you know, it was like a tumultuous teenage time. And so I don't know if I fully appreciated the beauty of that landscape. It just felt like really imposing at the time.
I've got more questions for you about the book, but just real quick, a question about living in seven different states and in so many places. What does that do to your perspective? Do you find that people are very similar everywhere? Or is just Kentucky's the best people you found and that's where you want to be? Or is that just where you are for now?
I think that, well, first of all, for me, I think what it has done for me is complicate the idea of home, or that question, where are you from? Is, I've been getting that question in general as a Black person, as an adoptee for my whole life. People sort of, seeing with my family and wanting to know, no, but where are you from, like, originally, like wanting me to say a different country, or that it complicates that, but it also just complicates this idea of like, well, where are you from in the country? I have a hard time with that question. And so for me, home is actually cultivated in people, right? I feel a sense of home in certain communities with the people that I love. And it's not necessarily about a specific place. I feel like there are lots of different places that have felt like home to me based on the community I had there, based on, the formative years that I've lived there. And so it complicates that idea. I definitely think there are good people everywhere. And I don't know if Kentucky is my, forever home and landing place. It's feeling really good right now. But it's, it's still a place where people hear me speak and they say, you're not from here, right? Which I'm not. Or people try to place an accent and have a hard time with it.
Aren't people charming with these questions?
Yeah. It's a complicated question. My answer is just that I found home in a lot of places. And I think even one of my bios floating around is like, calls many places home, because I do. Michigan is sort of a default home. I wasn't born there, but I spent formative years there. We landed there when I was in high school, and I spent high school and college and a little bit after college going back there. And my family is still in Michigan. And so, Michigan Michigan is where I learned how to drive. I feel like that's really formative, like learning to drive in, my parents' big Suburban in the snow.
And the real snow, not like we call it here in Indiana or Kentucky.
No,
we're talking higher than the vehicle you're driving in snow, right?
In Kentucky, when people are like, "Oh, it's going to snow today," and I'm like, that's nothing. I'm not digging out my car. It's fine. And then I'm like, oh, maybe I do feel like a Michigander when I'm saying things like that. So yeah, I think And I think that this is true of just my identity in general. It's like I feel like I belong in a lot of different places. I found home in a lot of different places. And sometimes that's really lovely. And I just sit in that, and I'm at peace with that. And then sometimes it can be really tiring, right, to have conversations with people, or people wanting to pinpoint or place or put me in a specific sort of box. And that's just not my experience. My experience is sort of, I've lived on the West Coast, I've lived on the East Coast, I've lived in the Southwest, I'm now living in the South, and I've lived in the Midwest. Like I've experienced all these different regions, and sure, some places have felt more I felt more connected to, but it's just given me a perspective of the ways people make their lives in multiple places of this country.
So since we're talking quite a bit about identity, and your book is very much about identity, I think it's a fair question to put you on the spot and ask, do you at this point feel like you have a good sense of who Mariama J. Lockington is, or is it still evolving, an unanswered question that you've got a good idea but not a definitive answer?
I feel pretty settled in who I am, but I also feel like when I talk to young people, I'm always talking about how you are as a person are always growing, and then there's always room for change, and for just to be expanding yourself and your idea of yourself. And so I would definitely say, though, that I don't think I could have written this book if I hadn't done some work on myself and my identity. And if I hadn't just been really interested in sort of grappling with some hard truths. And so I do feel at this point in my life that there are parts of me, that I feel really confident in, and that I'm not willing to sort of sacrifice, that I'm absolutely, I think as a young person and a young Black transracial adoptee, I had a lot of questions about what it meant to be a Black person, what it meant to be a Black woman. I don't it's not that I don't have those questions, but I feel very confident in the Black woman that I am these days. So yes, I feel like my answer is like yes, and yes, I feel like I know who I am today, but also that I'm definitely someone who's open to always learning more about who I am and what I can be, and always challenging myself also to check in as well. So it's kind of a
No,
middle
that makes perfect sense to me. I don't know that I could tell you definitively who Robert Kent is as of.
yeah,
I tell you who I am as of today. I
yeah,
can list a collection of things that happened to how I got here,
yeah.
and who I feel I am. But I'm hoping that there comes a moment, maybe when you're on your deathbed, right before it, where you go, "Oh, that's who I was." Ah, the end. And then on to the afterlife, presumably to continue to find who you are and who you're going
Yeah,
to be.
all the big questions all the time.
Let's see. Getting back to the book, because I do want to talk. I really enjoyed For Black Girls Like Me. There's something for the cover. If the publisher's listening for future editions, I like this book. Robert Kent, you got it.
Good to know.
But let's talk about. There's a true friendship here, and I always joke that in middle grade, friendship is the romantic subplot, or the main romantic plot. And so when you're writing about a friendship like Kata and Lena, what tips do you have for other middle grade writers that want to write this great epic friendship and to make that seem real?
Oh, that's such a good question. I mean, I guess my first tip would be, if it is not too traumatizing, is to think back to a middle grade friendship that you might have had, um, and to sort of remember, even just to sort of list or catalog the things that you remember doing with that friend or that bonded you to that person. Um, I feel like for me, for writing Lena and Kata, I tapped into sort of like three different friendships that I can remember from being a young person, at different times as a young person, like a friendship that I had when I was actually more the age of Lena and Kata, and then a friendship I had um, in high school, and then a friendship I had a little bit into college, and um, to sort of use all of those to sort of influence and inform the way that Kata and Lena talk to each other and communicate with each other in the book. And so that for me was sort of the process for just writing that friendship romance in a way in the book. And so I feel like trying to tap into that. I mean, one of the things that I've talked about a couple other times with this book, as far as writing Lena and Kata's friendship, and then just some other of the characters, is hanging out around middle schoolers if you have the opportunity to, and just listening to the way they talk to one another, also can be really helpful for getting that sort of urgency. Like, I feel like was an urgency about best friendship at that age, where sort of everything revolved around that person, and you sort of had like tunnel vision, about like, this is what we're going to do together, even if all we're going to do together is like pop popcorn and like watch this movie, but also we're just going to talk about the things that happened at school this week. And so yeah, I think tapping into that urgency and that memory of like, your whole world kind of did revolve around like, yeah, you had school, and yeah, you had your family and your parents, but like also like this friend that you were going to get to see and that you had this bond with in some way, shape, or form. And I think, I talk about this with young people. What bonds Kata and Lena is that, yeah, they share the same experience of like being two Black girls who are growing up with white families. And that is important to their friendship. It is something that bonds them sort of instantly, because they don't have to explain to one another like, oh yeah, that's my real dad, like they just get it, in the way that other people don't get. But I also talk about with young people the fact that the other thing that bonds them is that there are people who support each other's passions, right? So that Kata really loves to sing, Lena's really into gymnastics, and maybe they don't share, Lena's not a singer, Kata's not a gymnast, but they both really support and sort of admire that in the other person. And that's also part of what makes their friendship strong. And so also thinking about the ways that your two characters that you're writing in this friendship, like, what is the one thing that bonds them? And then what are the things around them that they're able to support in one another that also sort of propel the friendship along too. Like I love, when Lena goes to visit the Museum of African American Culture, she has her own priorities for that specific visit. But then she also finds something in that museum that she knows her best friend is going to like as well. And so finding those moments in it too. I don't know. I would want to know how I would want to ask that question of other middle grade writers too. I feel like I honestly just was like, let me think about my like most epic friendships from childhood or young adulthood. And then just like list out the things we used to do that seem ridiculous now, but that were just like very important at that moment. And we're going to create this little world. Like we're in this little bubble, even if all we're doing is like sitting under a tree or like in a fort or in, a friend's bedroom. Like it's just that sort of tunnel vision. And it was fun in some ways it was fun to tap into that. And I think also you have to write a friendship that's also like, also best friends then sometimes fight or like get in conflicts with each other, right? Or your friendship gets tested somehow. And so there are these moments with Kata and Lena of like, well, what's really happening over there? And these moments of like doubting the friendship too. And I think that's really true. Like one day you're like getting along great. And then the other day, like some small thing happens at school or with someone else and someone gets jealous. Like there's so much that happens, and it happens in this concentrated amount of time too.
So how, other than the obvious obstacle, they're no longer in the same space, breathing the same air. How do you create those obstacles in the friendship without pushing it beyond where it's realistic that friendship will continue beyond it?
Yeah.
Of course, when you're writing fiction, you have to create drama more intense than what happened in real life. Because my mom reads my fiction. She says, "Why are the mothers sometimes terrible? Was that a reflection on me?" No, Mom. If I get two characters on the page, they're going to be in conflict sooner or later. Drama has to happen. Nobody has a great marriage in my books, but my marriage is fantastic because my marriage would be boring to read about. That wouldn't turn pages.
No one wants a perfect character. Like you have to write characters that are flaws. Like Kata is definitely a flawed person, and there's some things that happen in the book that like she's responsible for in the same way that some of the characters in the book who are bullies are responsible for. And so you have to write that in. So I mean, I don't know if I have the answer for that, but I do think in this book Kata and Lena actually never appear in the same space with each other in this book. And one of the ways that I build tension between their friendship is actually through letter writing, is through correspondence. And so thinking about what happens when you have to leave a best friend like that behind, and what happens when you're the person that is left behind. And so I spend a lot of time like thinking about like, okay, let me put myself in Lena's shoes. I'm the one that's like left behind in some ways. And I'm watching Kata like have this, even though I wish she would stay here, she's also having this adventure. She's also getting to like see a new place. She's starting a new school. And so I thought a lot about Lena being like, even though Lena comes off as super confident, also thinking like, oh, well, what if she like gets a new friend in New Mexico and just forgets all about me or finds someone that's cooler than me? And that's like a real fear that sometimes I feel like you have when friends leave you or they go on. And then thinking about Kata in her shoes and thinking about, well, what does it mean to like maybe have a little bit of excitement and curiosity about this new place, but also leaving behind the familiar, and have to be the one that has to then enter into a whole another social aspect. So I thought a lot about like, well, what would they be communicating to each other in their correspondence to one another? And then what are the things that they're sort of like thinking and maybe not revealing to each other right away, or that will come out later? And that's a little bit how I tried to play with the tension, because again, we never get a scene in the present moment where Lena and Kata are physically in the same place. We get some scenes where they're talking, but it's all happening across a distance, which again is, also why I wanted to start the book with like, that road trip was like conveying the distance between her former life and her friendship and all the miles that she's traveling to get to this new place and everything that happens in between.
So let's talk a little bit about research. How much research did you do for this book? Was it just your own experience, or you talk? I mean, obviously you're talking with young people almost every day. But what research did you do specifically to create these characters beyond your own experience?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And so, I mean, because it is an own voices story and I'm writing pretty much from the perspective, like I share the perspective of my character. A lot of the things that I'm writing about were sort of taken from sort of like core emotional things that happened to me growing up. So emotions that I was going through and then translating them into a specific scenario that didn't necessarily happen to me in that way, but is about like microaggressions, right? Microaggressions that happen over the dinner table in her family, or things that not even microaggressions, just like racism that happens to her when she's out in the world. And so that stuff was not necessarily research, but sort of just thinking about how to translate my emotional experiences into like scenes as well. I think where I actually did some of the most research, which is gonna sound funny. So I do come from a musical family, but I may be like a bad okay, I'm not going to say I'm bad, but like I had to do research on some of the different the musical references that are in this book, some of the pieces. I spent a lot of time listening to different classical pieces that get referenced and remembering sort of the tunes and remembering the tones of them. I did a lot of research on Billie Holiday because she's a character or a figure that comes up um, in the novel, and I specifically researched her Carnegie Hall appearances, and so that was some research that I did. And then some other research that I will also say that I did, or just some research slash just making sure that I was writing characters in compassionate ways, was also that this book deals a little bit with mental health and specifically bipolar disorder. And I am not someone living with bipolar disorder. I'm someone living with anxiety. But I have many people in my life who are living with various mental illnesses or living specifically with bipolar disorder. So some research that I did was talking with friends and family and community members that I know, reading some books about that particular experience. And also talking with actually like licensed professionals to make sure I was understanding how to best explain what bipolar is to a young person as possibly a professional would explain it as well. So those are some avenues that I did some sort of like, in person or sort of academic research in. But a lot of it was also just taking sort of from the core of what I know emotionally to be true about growing up in this context, and then fictionalizing it as far as plot and scenes, if that makes any sense.
That absolutely makes sense. Did you get sensitivity readers at any point, or do you employ critique partners, beta readers? How do you smooth out those rough edges?
Yeah, so I mean, I 100% believe in making
That's
sure.
presumptuous of me. I have rough edges that need to be smooth. Your writing might be perfect, so
My
that might not be
My
necessary.
writing is not perfect. I didn't employ necessarily a sensitivity or cultural reader, but I definitely have a writing group. I mean, obviously, I have an editor, and those people are reading my work. But I actually have a group of friends who are also writers and of various different types of genres, and we actually meet. Well, it's been a little less lately. We've got a lot going on, but we try to meet actually over Skype, once a month if possible, if not once a month, every couple months. And it's an accountability group. And then also sometimes we send each other's work. And this is a group of people who yes, they are my friends, but I know that they are friends who are going to tell me when something is not working well or when there's a big question. And so there are people that I trust to actually give me constructive feedback and not just be like, this is amazing, because that's never helpful for a writer to just get something that's like, everything is great, and so
it's really pleasant, though. Might not be helpful, but it's wonderful feeling.
And it comes from such a good place. But I think, as the person I am, I don't want to hear something is, perfect or great, because I always know that there's something I can work on. In fact, I have a hard time letting go of something, knowing that there's always something more that you could probably do or tweak or make better. So I throughout writing this book, I had this really strong network of other authors, and not even authors who were working in the middle grade space, but who were working in playwriting or write nonfiction. And some of them are adoptees, and some of them are people of color, and some of them, like all these people were able to read and give me really different insights to sort of different holes throughout the process as well when writing this book. So that's always some of my advice to like a budding writer or a young person who wants to write, is like to find people in your life. It doesn't have to be like a formal editor, but someone who will read your work and ask honest questions that will help you then move your story along or your narrative along a little better.
So having these honest conversations, I've got 2 more questions for you, and then I want to ask you about school visits, and then we'll probably think about calling it a day. But I want to ask you, one, I want to give you a platform to tell esteemed audience what you want readers to know about transracial adoption. What if there's a takeaway from this, or multiple takeaways, what would you want them to take away? And then also, being that this is not an autobiography, but similar to your situation, and we're recording this in November, Thanksgiving's coming up, does that make things awkward then when you're sitting around the bird with the people that were in that experience with you? Or do they understand that this is your expression, that you need to get out there and say these things for you?
So I would say so it is November, and actually November is National Adoption Awareness Month. But one thing that I would want folks to know who are not familiar with the transracial adoptee experience is that there are a number of us who are adults now who are creating work around our unique perspectives, our experiences. And I think one of the biggest things that I hope that I have maybe achieved For Black Girls Like Me is I didn't want to write a narrative about adoption that's sort of what we call a fairy tale adoption narrative, that sort of makes it seem like as if this is sort of a one-dimensional experience where, it's a fairy tale, a young person like finds a family and then that's it. And there's, it's joyful all around, and there's never any questioning about sort of where this child came from in the beginning. And I think that the adoptee experience is very different and nuanced. And some of us feel sort of maybe more joyful about the experience than others, but it's really nuanced. And so the biggest thing I would just want people to take away is to seek out perspectives and narratives from adoptees about their experiences, because what we see about adoption maybe on the media or on the TV or in media narratives is sometimes really one-dimensional. And there are a lot of us who are writing about the nuances, that are writing about the sort of yes and, or living in the space of both, feeling like maybe we're feeling lucky or grateful or just joyful about our family, and maybe we're also still grieving and thinking about where we came from in the first place, and those things live side by side. So that's basically what I want people to know about transracial adoption. And then sitting around the dinner table and it being awkward was the second question, knowing that this is based on or inspired by, not based on, but inspired by my life was the second one, correct?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I mean, the answer that I give to this is that, like any family, no matter, how your family comes together, my family is a work in progress, and we are not always good at communicating with each other. So Thanksgiving can be awkward, and it cannot be awkward sometimes. I have been writing about my identity for a long time. So in some ways, it is not new that I've been interrogating these things. But I will also say that I was adopted in the 80s. When there weren't a lot of resources available to parents who were adopting transracially about the challenges that might arise, and sort of examining, what it means to raise a child of color. And so I think there are more resources available now for families who are trying to create homes that are safe and affirming of a child of color if they themselves are not. But I recognize that my parents did not have that when I was growing up. So we are still, like I said, a work in progress as far as like how we communicate about race and how we communicate about some of the harder topics that come up in For Black Girls Like Me, or that just have come up in our life. And so sometimes we are better at it than other years, and sometimes what is that sketch on SNL when it's like something awkward happens at the dinner table, you just put on an Adele song and like everyone is like magically like, sometimes that's a situation where it's like, all right, let's just put on Adele and like agree to disagree on this one. And I think that's the reality of the transracial adoptee experience, or just growing up in a multiracial family. You are not all going to see the world or experience the world the same way. And that produces conflict sometimes, but it's okay to sit in that conflict and sort of work through it if that's what's happening.
In my case, I'm married to an African American woman, and I've got a couple of relatives, without saying who are ardent Trump supporters.
Yeah.
So when we sit around at the table, there's awkwardness already.
All
My fiction is the least of it.
Yeah, it's just, I mean, every family has their stuff, and every family, I think, in some way is a work in progress. And what I really wanted to do with For Black Girls Like Me is just validate that Makeda can both experience absolutely racism outside of her home and her family, but also because we're human and because we sometimes carry privileges and biases that we don't intend to carry, that sometimes that happens over the dinner table too. And there are moments in For Black Girls Like Me when her mom or her dad or her sister says something that makes her feel othered. And those are moments that I hope will sort of promote conversation versus shutting people down, but promote conversation in maybe families who are reading this, and then maybe also provide validation to a young person who is experiencing that maybe doesn't have the language to understand that, oh, that's a microaggression or why that makes them feel bad. But knowing that it's in a book and that it's acknowledged is hopefully maybe something that will be validating in some small way.
I love the running image of Kata's hair and the different ways that creates issues for her and her family. My wife has a shirt that says, "No, you cannot touch my hair," that she wears proudly.
I'm going to get one of those for myself as well one day.
So that's just one of those nice concrete ways you can flesh out something that otherwise would be kind of cerebral, as opposed to, no, here's some nice concrete examples. What other concrete examples did you look for to put what am I looking for here? To make real what is otherwise a concept, as opposed to something that's actually happening that you could show on the page, as opposed to telling.
As far as the moments where Kata is feeling different or othered, is that what you mean?
Yeah, I mean, obviously it's a first-person narration, so sometimes you could just flat tell us.
Yeah.
Also go, you do the thing that we would expect an excellent author to do, and you show it to us.
Yeah.
So what was the process of finding some ways in which to put this concept into actual things you could show the reader?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think one of the things that I was really interested in showing in the experience of Makeda, which is also often the experience of just adoptees, is the feeling like you're really visible all the time because you look completely different than your family members, but then you're also kind of invisible at the same time because people don't see you as connected to your family members. So there's this weird, like, I'm here, but like, I'm also like not a face or not a human because I'm sort of invisible. And so I think a lot of the ways that I tried to show that in this book are, and that anxiety about, do people see me? Do people see me for who I am? Is a lot in sort of like how Makeda holds herself. And then some of sort of like the anxious, nervous things that she does when she's feeling that something is off in her world, or something is othering her, or there's some gaze that she doesn't like. So there's a lot of things about like sitting on her hands, or restricting like blood flow to parts of her hands, or there's a lot about like her shoulders tensing, or heat rising in her cheeks, or things that are happening internally to her when something externally is happening that's making her feel like maybe I don't belong here or maybe they don't see me. And so those were ways that I tried to play with that a little bit in the novel. And then, I mean, you brought up hair. Hair is really loaded. For transracial adoptees, it's loaded in general. I think, oftentimes Black women, Black people are always getting their hair touched. Like it's really loaded and it's really political. And Black hair is really loaded and really political. But specifically in families, adoptive families, there's a lot around like hair care, because Black hair is so different, or can be really different from white hair. And so it was actually really important to me. And that was actually one of the scenes that I wrote almost the last. It was a hard scene for me to write, but I really wanted there to be some agency from Makeda around her own hair, and then also to interrogate that complicatedness of wanting hair, wanting hair to be one thing, wanting her mom to not struggle with doing her hair, wanting hair like her sister, wanting to be proud of her hair, not understanding the different ways she could do her hair because she didn't have examples of it in her life. Like that whole scene was really important for me to write, but also really difficult to write because I wanted to get it right. And so that was actually a scene I did a lot of research and then also just like talking with other Black women in my life about like how to explain certain hairstyles, because I don't also have an extensive knowledge of Black hairstyles myself. So yeah, things like that, but definitely embodying that, like silencing that Kata is feeling sometimes, was part of portraying that in the novel.
A far more extensive knowledge of Black hair care than I did 15 years ago.
Yeah.
Although I was preparing for my son, because I figured when we had a child there might be some hair issues, and he's blonde. Yeah. He's got my hair. So
there's I'm forgetting the name of the organization, but there's actually an organization in Chicago that specifically works with adoptive families and does hair care workshops and tutorials, and is specifically marketed towards adoptive families with Black children. And they just had like a little short film that came out about them. If I remember it, I will send you the name for maybe notes. But yeah, there's a lot, like I said, there are a lot more resources and a lot more, I think internet has done a lot for sort of communities that are raising children of color. There's a lot more. And I think in turn, there's also hopefully a lot more visibility of adult adoptees who are talking about their like various nuanced perspectives growing up.
Well, there is now. Middle Grade Ninja podcast goes out everywhere.
Yeah.
So mission accomplished. That was such a thoughtful answer. I appreciate. I like that. Now, of course, I got to follow it up with a dumb question.
No.
Mariama J. Lockington, have you ever seen a flying saucer, and do you believe in them?
I have never seen a flying saucer, but I absolutely believe in them. And maybe one day I will. But yeah, I definitely believe that there is life out there that is not human, and that I might see one day.
We are quickly running out of time. I'm going to have to go get my buddy off the bus. But I do want to ask you about school visits, because who better than a professional educator who... so yeah, that's my question. What are the tips for a successful visit, and how are the best ways to get those set up?
Oh, well, I'm still, even though I've worked with young people in schools, the author school visit is sort of new to me, but my favorite thing that I've gotten to do as being an author, I think the tips for setting them up is, one, if you are an author, is just making sure that you have a school visit menu, either on your website or just, an idea of what you can offer when a school reaches out to you saying they'd like a school visit. So I did some research just from other authors that I know about sort of what they charge, if they charge for school visits, or how many school visits they do that are free versus charge, just sort of the business of it. And then putting together just a quick menu. So sometimes school visits are an assembly and you're talking to 150 plus students at a time. And so in those cases, you want to have like a PowerPoint, and it's you want it. Lecture sounds bad because that sounds boring, but basically in a setting like that, the kids want to hear from you. So they want to hear a little bit about you. If you have cute animal photos, that's always good to just like insert in there, embarrassing photos of you as a kid. And then almost just book talking your book if they haven't read it. What are the things that would hook students into your story? So I play music in my school visit. I talk about friendship. We do talk about adoption, but we talk about some big themes, and then we get a little bit smaller in context. And then if it's a school visit where you're going into a classroom and you get to talk to like 15 to 30 kids at a time, you could throw in some type of an activity or a writing workshop or a writing prompt or something that is a little bit more engaging if you have that opportunity with a smaller group. But you kind of have to tailor it to what the thing is. So I have a menu of like, here are some workshops that I can offer that are like writing and engaging. Here are 2 like book talks or lecture style presentations that I can do for a bigger audience. And then I always have something that's like, if you, if you have a specific event or something in mind, you can work with me and we can come up with a school visit that better fits your needs. And then I would just say, leave more time for questions than you think you need. I always underestimate how many wonderful questions young people have. And so I feel like I end up cutting my presentation off because I want to get to their questions, because they ask really unique and really wonderful questions, from everything about your book to the writing process to your life, if you're also writing from experience as well.
What's been your favorite reaction either to something you said at a school visit or to your book so far?
Okay, so this story is really important to me because when authors don't have usually a lot of control over the cover of the book, I was very fortunate to get a cover that I love. The artwork is done by a woman named Jemea Richmond Edwards. She's phenomenal. She's a phenomenal artist. But I really, really did want there to be a Black girl on the cover. So I wanted her to be, front and center. And that's what I got. But basically, I was in Colorado visiting my goddaughter, who was 8 at the time, when the email came through with sort of like, we've put together the cover. What do you think? And I looked at it. I loved it. And then my goddaughter was one of the first young people to see the cover, and I showed it to her. And her first reaction was just that her face lit up. And she just said, "That looks like a real Black girl." And that for me was like, all right, well, I love the cover. I have no feedback for it, because like the target demographic for this book saw it and was like, oh, that's a book for me, and that looks like a real Black girl. So that remains one of my favorite reactions to the cover itself. And then I think my other really quick one was I went and I did a school visit in DC, and it was a 5th grade classroom, and it was mixed genders. And I got in there, and the students were so excited. And they were reading it. They hadn't finished reading it. So they were all at various different points in the book. And this young boy tapped me on the shoulder, and he was just like, "I just want to let you know that I don't really like to read, but I am on page 127. And he like opened it and pointed to it, of your book. And he was like, "I just want you to know." And he was really excited about it. And so that was also one of my favorite reactions, was just like, "I just want to let you know that I'm on this page. I really like your book, and I'm not a big reader." And that was really validating. And from a young man too, because the book, says for Black girls like me. I think there's a lot that students of all genders can get out of this book. But I do know sometimes, people self-select or say, "Oh, that's a girl book," and don't want to read it. No such thing as a girl book or a boy book. But so that was a affirming, validating moment of just engaging a young reader.
That is adorable and swells my heart on your behalf. What have you got coming up next?
Coming up next, I'm, as we speak, working on my second book, which will come out in 2021. It is right now called In the Key of Us, and it is middle grade, about 2 young Black women who go to a music camp, and it is a romance. So it is going to be a romance for middle grade. And I am excited to tackle that, and it'll be out in 2021. And other than that, I am doing school visits when I am asked to, Skype and school visits. Have some festivals coming up in 2020. But otherwise, just trying to work on this book so that it will be out in the world for the next.
And people who want to get in touch with you to get you booked for a school visit now that they've heard how amazingly insightful you are, that, oh my God, we have to get Mariama to come and talk to us. How can they reach out to you? Where can they find you?
Yeah, so you can reach out to me on my website, which is forblackgirlslikeme.com. I'm also on Twitter at Mari Lock, on Instagram at forblackgirlslikeme. And I'm really responsive on all those platforms. In addition, you can find my email on forblackgirlslikeme.com. And I have an entire menu of school visits and a contact page that you can get in touch with me there.
Last question. So all the pressure in the world. 50th episode. Last question. Here we go. What is, if there was one or two bits of advice you could give to young you when you were starting to write, or just post slam poetry champion, you when you're venturing into middle grade, what advice would you go back and give yourself that would maybe have made all the difference and might make some difference for writers listening now?
Oh boy. I mean, one piece of advice that I think I would give myself and just any young writer is that, and I feel like this is not new or original, but is to read, and read widely. And then also not be afraid, especially when you're young, to mimic, right? Like, I think we learn so much about writing or about storytelling from writers that we admire. So it's okay if you don't necessarily know what your voice is yet. If you haven't found your voice, it is okay to start out by, like, for me, it was Saul Williams. So I wrote a poem in the style of Saul Williams that was terrible, but I, emulated that style, and that pushed me forward in finding my own voice and the things that I wanted to write about. And also just to remember that we tell stories every single day. And so I know that some young people are intimidated by, like, writing on the page. But if we just listen to the way we talk to each other. So another piece of advice I have for young writers is honestly to go out into the world and ear hustle, which is basically to eavesdrop. Don't spy on people, but just, like, go out into the world, go out at recess and listen to the way people are talking to each other, get snippets of conversation, and catalog those, because those can be really good sparks for either stories or for dialogue when you're writing dialogue. And that's, something that I wish maybe I told myself when I was younger, but just how much, like, part of writing is also being in the world, right? Like, part of writing is, yeah, you have to sit down and write, but also you have to live your life and meet new people and experience new things in order to become a more rounded person, and maybe to empathize with other people. So put yourself in situations that maybe are new or uncomfortable or challenging, and that's also good for writing.
That is an excellent note to end on. Esteemed audience, 50 episodes. We did it. Let's see if we can get another 50. As always, keep up with the show and what we've got going on at middlegradeninja.com. Mariama, this was just an absolute pleasure. Thank you again for making the time to come here and share all of this wonderful, insightful information with us today.
Thank you so much. I feel like we could have talked for much longer.
I know we could have. So when the next book comes out, hook me up with an arc and let's do it again.
Yes. Sounds good.
I have been asking all of our guests to sign us off with a very specific, totally justifies the name of the show sign-off phrase. And that sign-off phrase is the extremely ninja-like hi-ya and what have you. Will you sign us off?
Absolutely. Hi-ya and what have you.